Hello, everyone, and welcome to our continuing series, Life of the Mind. And thank you for coming out here on a cold, rainy day. This is our second session of this quarter with the thematic war. And today we have another three thought provocateurs, as we've labeled them, to try to introduce us to the concept from three different perspectives. And so what we'll do today is have about a 15 to 20 minute presentation, snapshot if you will. We'll run through the three of those and then ask all three of our colleagues to join each other up on the stage, have an opportunity to quickly interact with each other, maybe feed off of something that one of them said, and then we'll open it up to the audience. We are trying to archive these through the library's website. So when we do get to Q&A, we have a microphone up here. I know sometimes it's awkward to come on up, but for the benefit of being able to use these sessions in classrooms and for colleagues who could not make it today here for a live presentation, it's useful to be able to have your questions on the audio as well. So I just invite you up to the microphone. So to get us started, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Jacob Katz-Kogan from our own University of Cincinnati Law School, to speak on the thematic of war and his take, the laws of war in an era of asymmetric conflict. Jacob.
Thank you, and excellent to be with you today. I was asked to provide a very brief bio. So I've been at the College of Law now for 6 years, and before coming to the College of Law, primary experience that's relevant for us today is I spent 5 years at the U.S. Department of State in Washington at the Office of the Legal Advisor, where I worked primarily on issues of law enforcement and intelligence, and United Nations affairs. So I'd like to talk today about the laws of war in an era of asymmetric conflict. So the laws of war, and law often is based upon paradigm cases or default assumptions. So law is typically founded on an imagined world, imagined because it's derived from events, good or bad, that have already occurred, or imagined because we take certain things for granted. In other words, we have understandings about the way things work, how they operate, based on our own common experiences, and the law reflects those understandings. And this is no surprise, nor is it necessarily a bad thing. One of law's principal purposes is to regulate action, either to encourage or discourage particular behavior by individuals or institutions or countries. And necessarily, regulation presupposes a type of behavior that needs or might need reform. Regulation imagines the ways in which things occur or have occurred, ways that require positive or negative correction. To give a simple example, we have certain understandings about how people act, how they behave, based upon common notions of how the human mind works. And the rules of criminal law, particularly the parts of criminal law that deal with culpability and punishment, are based upon those assumptions of cognitive capacities. Indeed, much academic work in criminal law today pertains to trying to understand better how the human mind operates in order to bring the law into line with current research in neuroscience. The laws of war are no exception to this phenomenon of how law is made, in the sense that the law of war is based upon notions of how the world works. Though here we're dealing not with the human mind, as we are in criminal law, but with the structure of armed conflict. The laws of war, the international rules that govern the use of military force, were, in their creation in the mid-19th century and their subsequent elaboration for more than a century, based on certain understandings and assumptions about who engages in warfare and how war is conducted. Two such assumptions were particularly important. First, that in war there's such a thing as a defined battlefield, that is, the physical location where armed conflict takes place. so that civilians and civilian institutions, which are to be protected, could be distinguished from military personnel and material, which are legitimate targets. And second, that in war there are clear military objectives: conquering the enemy's territory and the gaining of the enemy's wealth or power. These assumptions themselves were based on other assumptions. They presume, for instance, a type of combatant, state-controlled military forces, and they presumed as well a type of enforcement mechanism to ensure compliance that is common to many types of international law: reciprocity and retaliation between the states that are parties to the armed conflict. Now, make no mistake, the laws of war were and are an amazing innovation. They seek to limit armed conflict to a particular setting, the battlefield, and to particular participants, the combatants, thereby freeing other places and other people, that is, civilian and civilian structures and institutions, from the horrors of armed conflict. The laws of war also attempt to limit warfare on the battlefield itself, and hence even protect combatants, by prohibiting certain types of combat and certain types of weaponry. The laws of war, in other words, were in their origins based upon a humanitarian notion that civilians should be protected and that war should be conducted in certain ways. It is not surprising, then, that the laws of war are commonly called today international humanitarian law. Now, as I said before, all this makes sense if we imagine war in a certain way, as an armed conflict between military forces of two or more states that accept the rules of engagement defined by the laws of war, what can be called symmetric warfare. It's symmetric not because the two or more parties to the armed conflict are perfectly equal in their capabilities, military or otherwise. That's never the case. It's symmetric because the parties operate under the same assumptions about the way war should work, and they operate too under the same legal constraints. This view of war as an armed conflict between two or more states regulated by the laws of war was, as a general matter, an accurate description of international military engagements for most of the past century and a half since the laws of war began in their modern form. Of course, that's not to say that the laws of war were always followed. And of course, there were other types of armed conflict during this time, such as civil wars, or the use of regular forces, or the activities of terrorists, that did not fit well within this paradigm. Yet the paradigm still held because it was, in practice, the dominant one. It was, to use the words I began with just earlier, the imagined world of that era. At least it was until recently. For the past 20 years or so, particularly, of course, within the past 10 years, the paradigm case of armed conflict has shifted from state-to-state conflict to one between states and non-state actors. And we can call this type of armed conflict asymmetric warfare. Think Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or the irregular forces that operated in Iraq during the Second Gulf War. Asymmetric warfare is different, though, not simply because one of the participants is a non-state actor. Asymmetric warfare is different because the interests and actions of the parties to the armed conflict have changed from those that obtain in symmetric warfare. As a result, asymmetric warfare, particularly the actions of the non-state party to the armed conflict, undermine both the assumptions on which the laws of war are based that I mentioned earlier. First, asymmetric warfare undermines the idea that there is a battlefield, the sphere where the armed conflict takes place. Because in asymmetric warfare, non-state actors purposely mingle with civilians, thereby confusing the distinction between military and civilian targets. Second, in asymmetric warfare, non-state actors do not hold territory in the same way as states. Indeed, the taking of enemy territory in the context of asymmetric warfare can be a double-edged sword for the state actors, precisely because non-state combatants intermingle with civilians. But it's not just that asymmetric warfare in its practice undermines the assumption on which the laws of war are based. Asymmetric warfare reflects the calculated decision of one party, the non-state actor, to ignore the laws of war themselves. As one author has put it, in asymmetric warfare, one actor endeavors to compensate for its military, economic, or other deficiencies by resorting to the use or methods and means of warfare that are not in accordance with the law of armed conflict. Indeed, asymmetric avoidance of the law of war is an intentional tactic that exploits the state actor's adherence to long-held notions of war and the rules that govern it. This new type of warfare, or at least its prevalence and importance in the contemporary era, has critical real-life consequences for professional militaries and the governments that depend on them. When dealing with non-state actors, the military objectives of state actors must necessarily be based on a different calculus. Instead of territory in asymmetric warfare, states seek as their goal the elimination or capture of their opponents wherever they may be, including in places far away from those traditionally described as the battlefield. In doing so, states tend to kill more civilians than in symmetric warfare because non-state actors do not distinguish themselves as state actors are required to do. All this results not only in more deaths, but also greater societal instability. It also undermines the very idea that law can regulate the conduct of war. After all, in asymmetric conflict, one of the sides, the non-state actor, is ignoring the laws of war, and the other side, the state actor, must respond in ways that might very well put itself in jeopardy of violating those same rules, or, alternatively, by abiding by the law, place itself at a military disadvantage. So asymmetric warfare presents a different paradigm case from the one on which laws of war were originally based. And this presents a serious problem that policymakers, practitioners, academics are well aware of, but there's no consensus on how to deal with it. One approach concludes that the traditional laws of war are satisfactory and can apply to asymmetric warfare as they do to symmetric warfare. It's true that the rules may place greater burden on state actors, as they are the ones whose actions are more effectively limited by law, non-state actors having decided not to abide by it. But proponents of this approach see this as unavoidable if we are to maintain the goal of limiting warfare in accordance with humanitarian ideals. This approach is at least potentially problematic because it requires one of the parties to the armed conflict, the state actor, to act, at least potentially, at a severe tactical disadvantage. This will likely lead to greater military casualties, which could ultimately undermine the support for the use of the military force among the state's domestic constituencies. States will refuse to constrain themselves in this way. Some argue that better enforcement of the laws of war through domestic or international criminal prosecutions will solve the problem of noncompliance by non-state actors that leads to this tactical disadvantage, but it seems unlikely that the non-state actors are in fact deterred by such prosecutions. Another approach to this problem is to say that the laws of war as they are simply are not appropriate to the context of asymmetric warfare. We need instead, it's argued, new substantive norms, a new legal regime to govern this new way of war. This approach, too, though, is problematic, as in practice, it would be difficult to accomplish because the barriers to the creation of new international law through treaty making are quite high. And it's problematic as well if the new regime sought to reduce humanitarian constraints that operate under the conventional laws of war. For those that are sympathetic to the view that the baseline rules of the laws of war must be retained, even in this new era of asymmetric warfare, and I fall into this category, technology, not law, might be the solution. In asymmetric warfare, non-state actors ignore the distinctions between the civilian and the military that is required by the laws of war. Non-state actors mix among civilians, sometimes using them as human shields. Technology, though, can increase the ability of state actors to gather intelligence on the movements of non-state actors in civilian locations, and can also provide the capacity to attack with precision those non-state actors outside the traditional battlefield through the use of drones and other targeted attacks. In other words, the use of these new technologies is a mechanism to have it both ways, to abide by the standard rules of law with regard to war while not putting conventional armed forces at a severe disadvantage. The killing of Osama bin Laden is a good example. In that case, information gathered through sophisticated intelligence gathering provided the US military with the opportunity to remove bin Laden even though he was located in a civilian locale, not in a conventional battlefield. In some situations, and with this I'll conclude, technology acts as a challenge to established law. If we think back to criminal law, sophisticated technologies are being used by governments in domestic investigations in ways that challenge established understandings, at least in the United States, of constitutional guarantees. In the international context, though, at least in regards to the laws of war in this era of asymmetric conflict, technology may very well be serving as a mechanism for maintaining the law, not revising it.
Sorry about that. Coping with war will be our next take on our thematic today from Dr. Sigrun Haude of our College of Arts and Sciences, Department of History. Dr. Haude.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Provost Ono, his advisory committee, and the library staff for organizing the series and for inviting me to speak at this event. And I'm also supposed to give a little blurb about myself. I am the early modern European historian in the history department, and my special topic is the Reformation period. And so it will come as no great surprise to you that the war that I will be talking about occurred sometime back in Europe. I'm not referring to World War I or II, which probably immediately come to mind, but about the 30 Years' War, which took place in the first half of the 17th century, from 1618 to 1648, and has gone into history as the first European war. According to a New York Times article earlier this month, entitled Population Control Marauder Style, the 30 Years' War makes the top 10 list in the percentage category of world population loss for any war ever fought. Begun as a local fight over religious and political control in Bohemia, what is today the Czech Republic, the 30 Years' War eventually drew in almost every country in Europe. Dynastic ambitions on the territorial level were overlaid with a fight over what Europe should look like politically and religiously. Largely fought on German soil, the war was particularly destructive to the German lands and people, although the drain of soldiers from all over Europe was immense. The conflict marked the endpoint of a century and a half of struggle for stability in Europe and was concluded not following a decisive victory on either side, but because of sheer exhaustion and horror over the unprecedented scale of destruction. While considering all this devastation, two significant aspects need to be kept in mind. First, the greatest loss did not come from the battles themselves, but from the repercussions of war, such as forced contributions, inflation, famine, disease, pestilence, plundering, and violence. These effects were more profoundly felt along the path of troop movement than in areas further removed from the army routes. And here you see, this is the area particularly of troop movement from where the Swedish troops first landed in Peenemünde and then going along this diagonal route. This circumstance leads to the second point: the war did not hit every region equally. And here you see a map that shows the distribution of population loss in the various areas. You see once again that the greatest loss was along these routes, with over 50% in these orange, red marked territories. And for example, in the areas in the northwest, Schleswig-Holstein, Bremen, Hamburg, these areas, the loss was very slight. So, for example, a place like Hamburg at the North Sea not only had a very low death toll, but also profited greatly from the war. My own research focuses on several South German regions around Nuremberg and Munich, nowadays all part of Bavaria, which, depending on the area, suffered between 30 and 60% population loss. So how did people deal with a war of such magnitude, length, and severity? Windows into attitudes and behaviors of early modern European society very much depend on extant sources. A good many documents are available to us through the church, partly because the clergy could write, but also because the church encouraged or demanded and then preserved such records. Among them are diary-style chronicles and parish records that throw light on the clergy and the parishioners. One sentiment runs constant throughout these accounts: fear. Fear permeated everything, whether it was anxiety over one's safety and livelihood or over the uncertainty of roads that made travel a terrifying endeavor. To give one example, the Augustinian nuns near Eichstätt, Bavaria, lay in the line of troop movement and in the early 1630s experienced the destruction of their convent. This frightening experience made their prioress, Clara Steiger, and her nuns shrink back in horror at the mere mention of a troop's approach. The continuous attacks wore Clara down and brought her to the brink of what she could endure. Clara experienced anxiety of varying intensity. Certain events almost drove her out of her mind. When the Swedes took Eichstätt in 1633 and then for 10 consecutive days bombarded the castle where the sisters had sought protection and from where they watched the destruction of their cloister, the prioress felt a deadly fright that threatened to overcome her. Quote, "I'm so deeply afraid that I thought I would lose my body and my life, yes, even my sanity, Verstand, since no one knows the outcome of the siege." Evidently, more than death itself, Steiger dreaded losing control of her mind. At the end of the war, in March 1648, the enemy entered their territory once again, and the nuns fled anew to the castle. On the way, they witnessed how soldiers broke into their cloister, which they had just finished rebuilding after the last attack. And it must have been excruciating to see their newly rebuilt home threatened anew with destruction. And what about the terror of the 20 sisters who stayed behind to look after the cloister? Having to suffer such fear, the diary suggests, leaves an indelible mark upon one's life, one that was shared by many but could not be communicated. The fear was so visceral because the civilians emerged as the prime targets of this conflict. The war predates the arrival of garrisons and regular pay for soldiers. Instead, armies were stationed among the populace and often were expected to feed off the land and the people. The result was the utter devastation of the countryside and its peasantry. The excesses of brutality are graphically described in many accounts of the war. And I have a few images here of artists of this time period. This is one of a French artist who portrays the various forms of torture that marauders were executing on the population. Here, hanging someone over a fire, and obviously rape was as is still a very important way of getting at the enemy. And here is just the day-to-day violence of people who were trying to flee with their belongings, violence against everyone, especially women, houses burning down. Not everyone managed to endure the terrifying reality of war. A particularly graphic example of the literally overwhelming pressures of war comes from the Brigidine cloister in Altomünster, Bavaria. Most nuns had been able to flee to Munich before the enemy advanced on their cloister in late April 1632, but 2 nuns who had been unable to travel starved to death. When the others returned, they found their market ruined and burned down, even though the flames had spared their cloister. Shortly after their arrival in 1634, the plague hit the cloister and killed 15 sisters. When in early May 1635 the abbess was unable to find food for her charges, she finally snapped and hanged herself. Neither familiarity with nor distance or temporary reprieve from the brutality of war could reduce the panic. The fear of harm could be as debilitating as the harm itself. It could paralyze men and women, and only the most resourceful were able to overcome its poison. Rumors about impending attacks circulated wildly, stirring up fear and panic. It took a realistic mind to assess and react to these reports in an appropriate manner and to keep the paralyzing elements of fear at bay. And indeed, one of the most striking characteristics of people successfully dealing with the war was their keen sense of reality. Making informed judgments about what kind of action a situation required, they glanced often with concern, but sometimes with surprising optimism toward the future. The many losses and the constant fear could not deter Clara Steiger from continuing her work and from being hopeful about what lay ahead. Even though her cloister's horses and other animals were perpetually raided and confiscated, she purchased new livestock whenever possible. Despite the fact that countless supplies were robbed while in transit, she continued to organize shipments. When in early 1634 her cloister was finally entirely destroyed, she surveyed the ruins and began to plan the construction of a new cloister. Some of the sisters moved back in between the ruins to start the spring crop. It is amazing that despite the unbelievable misery, men and women did carry on and tried to apply whatever ingenuity, resources, and courage they could muster to escape the deathly maelstrom of war. People confronted the war on a pragmatic and a psychological level. Modes of behavior depended on a range of factors, chief among them geographic location, gender, social and political networks, and personality. Negotiations constituted a vital strategy to survive the rampage of war, and it was a tactic exploited at every social level. Whether trained professional negotiators hired by civic communities to reduce payments and provisions to armies, or plucky nuns trying to save their convent by offering commanders their preserves, all of them realized the importance of negotiating skills to mitigate their situation. If bargaining did not help, armed resistance and other forms of self-help represented a second way of encountering the violence. Authorities were mostly overwhelmed and under-equipped to protect their subjects. Therefore, the populace had to rely largely on its own initiative and ingenuity to protect itself. This was particularly the case with regard to the peasants, who were the greatest victims of the war. They pooled their resources to provide protection while working the fields and banded together to go after plunderers. More frequently, however, contemporaries opted for flight. Typically, this meant a temporary escape to a presumably safer haven until the danger had passed, rather than permanent immigration. The pastor of one Bavarian village had to flee 10 times from his parsonage. Once the minister escaped the soldiers by hiding in the cesspool. More popular were hideouts in forests. Others took refuge in neighboring castles or abbeys, which became so cramped that people could find standing room only. To put walls between themselves and the plundering troops, many peasants made for nearby cities. One can imagine that staying in these more fortified places was only the lesser of two evils. Rarely were cities equipped to accommodate thousands of peasants, complete with their belongings and farm animals. Some refugees were able to rent a room in a burgher's house, but the rest had to contend with the streets. the almost inevitable result of invasions from the countryside was price increase, hunger, and epidemics. These consequences were palpable in the diary of Hans Heberle, a shoemaker of a village near Ulm, an imperial city in southern Germany, who over a period of 18 years fled 28 times to the city of Ulm. During his third flight, he noted, quote, "There's distress and misery, starvation and death. There we lay on top of each other in great wretchedness. Then price increase and hunger broke in on us. After these, the evil disease, pestilence. Many hundreds of people died during this year, 1634. Heberle lost his second son as well as 3 of his sisters and a brother in this flight. A curious pattern is visible in this moving about. The reshuffling of living arrangements is reflective of society's hierarchy of power, social class, and gender. Nuns moved into the quarters that monks had just vacated on their flight to a safer haven, and peasants made for the city from which the better off citizens had fled. Safety was a relative term in any case, but evidently it could only be attained proportional to one's gender and station in society. How did people deal with the war on a psychological level? Writing down one's experiences was one way of coming to terms with what happened. Placing one's thoughts outside of oneself on paper could alleviate the heavy burden. But authors continuously pushed against the limits of language since some of their experiences could not be put into words. They frequently broke off in the middle of a painful description and declared they were unable to narrate the full extent of the outrage. Words could not convey, nor human understanding grasp the true magnitude of horror and pain. Such utterances reflect both the constraints and the power of language. Writing down the details of an ordeal meant having to endure the suffering all over again. There was then a fine line between easing the burden of one's experience and being overwhelmed by it anew. Many looked toward religion for comfort. One might expect that as a consequence of the continuous agony, people focused on the presumably happier afterlife in their desire to flee this vale of tears. But rarely does one see this escapist trend in the diaries. For most, religion was not an escape, but a consolation and an anchor as the mayhem of war broke out around them. Another way of coping with war was by trying to make sense of it. Knowing why one suffered helped to bear the misery. Frequently, these attempts carried religious connotations. Especially the educated understood the war as God's punishment for human sinful behavior. Here was at least one rationale to explain and understand the reason for their afflictions, which also held out hope for an end of the misery. Sermons and political writings urged contemporaries to mend their ways so that the punishment would cease. Many made sense of the war by casting it as a battle of religions or confessions. One's own religion represented that of the true believers, while the enemies were followers of the devil. Catholics and Protestants respectively boosted their own religious confession and righteousness by denigrating the opponents. In fact, propaganda went a step further by portraying it as a cosmic, apocalyptic struggle between good and evil, between the forces of Christ and Antichrist. Here you see the occupied city of Augsburg, the imperial city of Augsburg in southern Germany, Bavaria, and the animals, the beasts of the apocalypse. It was a means to mark and reinforce one's identity, to provide comfort to followers, and to claim religious, if not necessarily military, victory. In such ways, contemporaries found meaning and comfort as they grappled with the violence of war. But what happens when one can no longer neatly separate enemies and friends? when the purpose behind all this suffering is no longer clearly discernible? What if one could not trust one's own troops? If they plundered your homestead or monastery or village as furiously as the enemy troops did? What indeed if one's own troops were worse than the enemy's? The experience of destruction from one's own friends shattered people's worldview. The sociologist Peter Sloterdijk calls these experiences Störerfahrungen, a term that denotes occurrences, quote, that explode hitherto experiences, convictions, or behaviors that have been taken for granted. How can one make sense of a war if the basic principles with which one understands the world no longer apply? How can one maintain hope if one's own troops have become the enemy and there's no recourse left? From our own experience with war in recent history, we know that it is easier to cope with suffering and sacrifice if the world is clearly divided into good and bad guys, and when we know on what side we are. World War II is a perfect example. Those Americans who sacrificed themselves in their fight against Hitler have gone down in history as indisputable heroes. Those who lost a loved one could find comfort in the fact that he or she died for a worthy cause. What if the lines between good and evil are no longer clearly drawn? If the worth of the cause is debatable, maybe questionable, or difficult to discern? Military conflicts of more recent decades have been less a matter of black and white and have proved more challenging to come to terms with. Looking back at the 17th century, the strategy of demonizing the opponent in religious terms worked fairly well during the early years of the conflict. But the mounting violence and a seemingly unending war also led to a profound questioning of identity. With the build-up of unspeakable atrocities on both sides over 3 decades, religion's content, function, and justification came under review and contributed to the growth of religious skepticism and of more inward-looking forms of religion, such as pietism. After years of negotiations, the 30 Years' War did finally come to an end. And here are a couple of images of the celebrations that mark the peace agreements. This one comes from Antwerp, where civic authorities put on fireworks, which can't quite compete with ours, but this is a nice attempt. And here in Nuremberg, the city council put on a feast, and you see this is a fountain, red wine coming out of this one and white wine coming out of that one, and they were feasting on this. The concluding Peace of Westphalia in 1648 was a treaty unprecedented in its scope and became the blueprint for the development of modern international law. Indeed, law, not religion, emerged as the new force that established the principle of equilibrium between the powers of Europe. For the involved political parties, it proclaimed an amnesty that granted an, quote, everlasting forgetting, forgiving, and pardoning of injustices. On the smaller scale, among society up close, forgetting was much harder to achieve. Thank you.
And our final cut today on our theme, war. We're joined by Dr. Jay Johanneman from our College of Medicine and professor of surgery in our Department of Surgery. War is and is not. Thank you, Jay.
I'd like to echo my thanks also to Provost Ono and to the committee. And by means of biography, I'm a local kid. I grew up in Cincinnati and came here for my residency and training and began a journey that I'll share with you a little bit, in part because in order to matriculate through medical school, I accepted a scholarship in the Air Force. But what I want to show you today was perhaps a little bit different perspective. We on the eastern end of the campus, involved in the College of Medicine, are academicians and share the college title with you, but sometimes it brings us a little bit different direction. People talk about the fog of war. I owe this to my good friend Dr. Pamela Baker from the Center for Enhancement of Teaching and Learning. Showed me what we did is gathered up some of my emails to my family and friends, and this is a wordle. This is kind of the fog that I still reflect back on. I've had the opportunity now to deploy on 5 separate occasions, 4 to Iraq and 1 to Afghanistan, and trying to sort out my thoughts to share with you. This represents some of the word bites of what we'll show you today. When thinking about how to present this, I will share with you a personal issue that when I left here in 2003 for my first deployment, I was then privileged to be the director of University Hospital's Level 1 Trauma Center. And having been in the military then for some 22 years, it was my fervent hope that after I came back from Iraq, I could promise mothers and fathers in our community that if they were brave enough to send their sons and daughters to war, that our country would provide them the very best of care overseas, and that their care would be equivalent to what I was doing as a trauma director here in Cincinnati. I will tell you now, 5 deployments later, I will share with you that journey that I now tell parents in Cincinnati, Ohio, that their children are alive at our trauma center because of the lessons we have brought back, as we must, from the events of the last 10 years. Many people may not actually realize that Cincinnati is truly unique. The University Hospital and our Department of Surgery, we are one of 5 centers in the United States that has partnered with the military, and we have a center called C-STARS, and over the course of the next, hopefully, few minutes, I'll try to share with you what C-STARS really is, but it's truly a unique Cincinnati collaboration with everyone from our healthcare system to UC surgeons, the United States Air Force, the city of Cincinnati, and all of its citizens, and our own university. But to begin the journey, this is last year, this is where I was at. This is Craig Theater Hospital. This is Bagram Air Base at the base of the Hindu Kush. We were at 5,400 feet. Nestled in the Hindu Kush. That's what it looked like from above. It was actually an old Russian air base, and the reason for us locating ourselves in the air base, I think, will become apparent a little bit later during this conversation, but the air hub is extremely important to the process of caring for our wounded soldiers. I would be remiss to tell you that there's not a day that goes by that I don't think of these people. These are the finest professionals I've ever had the privilege of serving with, working with, medics, of our Craig Joint Theater Hospital, all of whom in that picture are home today, but the medics at our theater hospital at Craig are still over there and still actively caring for our soldiers. Well, let me take you on a journey. This is a young man that I had the privilege of taking care of, not unlike a lot of the young men and women who are on the campus here. Zach is in fact a 19-year-old soldier. War is evolutionary. You must learn quickly or you will not survive. The enemy has learned that our soldiers wear body armor and wear it always. But there are some weak spots in the body armor, particularly on the sides here where we don't have plates. And the snipers of the Taliban have learned to target the sides of the body armor. And Zach, on patrol in the southern Helmand province, was taken with a sniper round in his side, a transpelvic gunshot wound. One of the things that we've learned to do is we actually have gone back to history, and we've learned to care for our soldiers as we were taught in the First, Second World War at Korea. That is, to be meaningful to our soldiers, you have to be close to them. So in this conflict, as well as in Iraq, we have redistributed all of our surgical facilities and broken them down into exceedingly small units, numbering 20 and 30 in size, so that these small field hospitals can be very close. And so in this case, there was a field hospital by the name of Shank that was sitting down here in the Logar Valley. As you can see here, we were up here at Bagram. Zach and his troops were actually in the Logar Valley when he was shot. And Zach was taken immediately here. Now, this is not much to look at, but this is Zach's salvation, and this is how we take care of our soldiers now. That's the base. That's up at actually 7,000 feet. HESCO barriers, which are just those barriers that protect the soldiers. And in the middle of that really very high plateau land is this. In 2011, this is state-of-the-art, and you say to yourself, oh my God, it's a tent. Yes, it is. It is a tent that can do the most amazing things in the hands of appropriately trained surgeons. That's the 909th Forward Surgical Team. That is the entire crew of the Forward Surgical Team. It consists of 4 doctors, 5 nurses, a nurse anesthetist, and all the rest of those people you see there are all enlisted personnel. That's their hospital. This picture is particularly dear to me and to my chair, Mike Edwards. I was sitting at 3 o'clock in the morning at Bagram, and one of my jobs there was to welcome all the physicians coming through before they would go out. And this physician was transiting to Schenck, and I looked up, and that's Dr. Ted Kutlis. Ted Kutlis and I graduated from the University of Cincinnati's general surgery residency training program together. Ted was 2 years behind me. The last time we had seen each other was over at University Hospital, and lo and behold, there's Ted on his way to Schenck. That's Ted's operating room. It's in a tent. It's not very glamorous, but it kept Zach from bleeding to death, and Zach was inside that tent. Within 24 minutes of being wounded, Zach's inside that tent on that table. Now, Ted actually practices as a pediatric cardiothoracic surgery in Greenville, North Carolina. The last time Ted did a general surgery operation was 20 years ago, but Ted has gone back. Ted voluntarily joined the Army 5 years ago to serve, and this is his second deployment. Zach ends up in Ted's very capable hands, and what Ted needs to do out there is simply keep Zach from bleeding to death, and that's exactly what he did. He opens Zach up, puts packs in him, ties off the areas that are bleeding, and stabilizes him. In the meantime, he tells his helicopter unit, wind up the bird, because as soon as I've finished, we're going to move Zach from here at Schenck, where I showed you in the middle of that plateau, to Bagram, because we were a bit more capable. We had a bit more opportunity. We had a larger and more robust medical facility. So there we are actually waiting for him at Bagram, and that's Zach actually. And the way we do this is we know that Zach's going to come straight off the helicopter and right back into my operating room. So Zach's actually not even closed. His belly is left open inside a sterile wrapper with towels inside of him to keep him from bleeding. So Zach comes straight off the helicopter to us at Bagram, and right off there he goes straight to the operating room. Because we had communicated, we knew Ted had this young man who was as sick as they could handle. He's already now in our operating room. This is literally 3 hours from the time that Zach was wounded. He's now gone through one operating room. He's in the second operating room, and we actually had the good fortune. We actually worked 2 tables in every room because of our to be efficient and to talk with each other and to work as teams together. We actually put 2 tables in every room. A little bit different than what we do back at our own university hospital, but that way one surgeon can be working hand in hand with perhaps a more junior surgeon. One anesthesiologist can take care of 2 critically injured at the same time. So actually Ted had done everything he needed to. My job was pretty straightforward. There were a couple little bleeders we had to clean up, and I did some surgical things, but Zach is now beginning to look a whole lot better. He's not going to bleed to death. He's doing very well, and remind me, I'll get you back to Zach here in a little bit. But some of the things that are transformational to me in my job as a civilian trauma surgeon are lessons I've now brought back from Iraq and Afghanistan. On the left there, you see a picture of a blood vessel in the arm of a soldier that had been shot out. And rather than try to restore that blood vessel in the small tent where Ted is at Schenck, where it's very tedious and very difficult, Ted actually just throws in a little piece of plastic tubing and connects the broken ends of the artery, and then ships Zach away to a larger hospital such as ours. When we get a soldier like that, instead of having an arm that has no blood flow and is ischemic and no longer functional, the arm is actually working and viable, and so it's much easier for us to fix. Now in Cincinnati, Ohio, on average of about 8 times a year, I'll receive a young person from our own city who's been shot and shot through a blood vessel. And our trauma surgeons or myself, whoever's on call, will take that person right up to the operating room, restore the perfusion, and then we can call all the expertise we have at the University Hospital, vascular surgeons, vascular specialists, orthopedic specialists, and while they're all coming in, we know that that arm is doing well. We work in parallel and tandem. There's an orthopedic and a general surgeon working together. There are no specialties there. Everybody is a surgeon. Well, what I've told you is that we've actually gone backwards in history and gone back to our paradigm of being close to our soldiers. But if we do that and then we take care of Zach and Zach survives, we've now created a secondary problem. Namely, we have Zach, a kid who's desperately ill, as sick as anything I can take care of at University Hospital, but he's sitting in the middle of the desert. This is actually my first deployment. This is Talil Air Base in Iraq, and when we first arrived at Talil, those 4 tents right there were our entire hospital. Now you're trying to take care of this young man who's gone through 2 operations, 15 units of blood, he's on a ventilator, and you're trying to do ICU care in the middle of the desert. Well, you have 2 options. You can either try to haul an ICU out to the middle of the desert, which we never can do logistically, or instead, what we've done in the Air Force is design teams that can work and fly all the way out forward and under critical care capability, bring that soldier back home. So one of the things that we do here in Cincinnati actually is we train all the CCAT teams for the United States Air Force and the military. That's what we do at University Hospital. So schematically, it used to be true all the way through Vietnam. If you were wounded in Vietnam, you stayed in a hospital in Vietnam up to about 3 to 4 weeks until you were well enough to walk on a plane and be evac to Japan. Now we have moved our surgical field hospitals way far forward, but we've also brought critical care teams so that we can move these soldiers with critical care teams. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the average length of time that a soldier is actually in theater between being wounded and being in Germany is 27 hours. And that includes 1 to 2 operations in the theater before we get them home to Germany. My record when I flew CCAT in 2005 is I had a young man that we actually had to Germany at the 17th hour with 2 operations under his belt. So it's a dramatically different evacuation scheme. And these things you guys think are airplanes. I think that there are mercy angels. One of the things the Air Force has done, we own lots of aircraft, but we don't have a single airplane that has a Red Cross on its tail. We do not own an air ambulance. We do not own a specialized piece of equipment to move these soldiers. The one thing the Air Force recognized a long time ago is we have these things flying everywhere. And that's why we're at an air hub, because every day, the air hub at Bagram is the world's busiest airport right now, and it's always bringing in cargo. And what happens is we take one of those planes and immediately empty the cargo and turn it around, and that's going to be Zach's ride home, and I'm going to show you that in just a bit. So we've been really lucky. We've been involved in the CCAT training process. I had the opportunity to fly the first CCAT mission in about 1993 when I was a young Air Force officer down in San Antonio, Texas, and we brought that whole system forward. But here you see our CCAT teams consisting of a physician, nurse, and I'll show you a little film clip that'll detail this a bit better. But there they are taking care of that young man up on the right-hand side there is actually fully asleep under general anesthesia. He's had his brain operated on for a penetrating fragment injury. We're monitoring the pressure inside of his brain, and he's under complete anesthesia with a critical care team taking care of him on his way to Germany. Most people don't know this is us. This is University Hospital and the University of Cincinnati, and the academic mission here is to teach our United States Air Force. Every member of the Air Force who wants to fly or who will fly in CCAT comes through Cincinnati. We've been in existence since about 2001. We have 15 or so classes a year, trained a total of around 1,500 medics, and I'll show you a little bit what this is like. If you have the opportunity to come over to the east side of town, the campus, this is actually right outside my ICU, and I want you to pay attention because you're going to see this in this little film clip I'll show you. That's actually about 30 feet from the ICU where I'll be working tonight. That used to be the resident call room, but the residents don't need to sleep anymore, so we just... This one's a particularly proud. Because we are partnered with the Air Force has actually stationed 15 active duty Air Force personnel. This is our active duty cadre. If you come over to University Hospital, you'll see people wearing ABUs and flight suits. That's where they work. That's where the Air Force assigns them. That's our cadre. And I don't know if any of you recognize this person standing right there. Does anybody know who that is? That's Bob Woodruff. Bob was flown out of Iraq by this team right here and was cared for by this person here, who's Colonel Dr. Warren Dorlack, who recently retired from the Air Force, was our commander of our C-STAR Center, and now has joined us as an academic associate professor of surgery and trauma here in Cincinnati. Warren took care of Bob Woodruff in Germany and helped get Bob home. So this is Bob, and you see about a year and a half ago, Bob came back to visit us, and we were very, very grateful. Let me remind you about Zach. Zach did very well. Sometimes these kids are so strong and so healthy, you just have to be smart enough to stay out of their way while they get well. But I don't know if any of you have had the privilege of being in the military, but there is still inter-service rivalry, let me assure you. And I'm in the Air Force, which is the smallest military branch, and the Army loves to kid us and make fun of us. So we, in return, couldn't help but make sure that we were flying our Air Force jerseys behind every bed in the ICU. And I don't know if you can see, but Zach's he's a little bit stunned still. Zach's waking up from surgery, has a few narcotics on board, but Zach still knows he's in the Army. And as soon as we see him awake, and he's going to go home tonight, he's leaving us in about an hour and a half, we had to tease Zach. Zach, what do you think of the Air Force taking you Army boys all the way home to Germany? Well, one thing is, they don't lose their sense of humor. They don't lose their sense of humor. But let me remind you, this young man was bleeding to death 5 hours before this picture was taken. And now he's doing well enough that we can have a hua moment with him. And I tracked Zach all the way home. Zach was actually home in the United States about 5 days after this picture was taken. He has since had his surgery, his colostomy reversed, and Zach has actually been returned to active duty. In fact, Zach's redeploying next summer back out to Afghanistan. There goes Zach going home on a CCAT mission. That's a C-17. We always move in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock, which will make sense here in just a second. We have to learn to take care of these people. I can work in an ICU with lights on in a nice sterile environment here at University Hospital. That's a dream, but doing this in the middle of the night so we're not targeted by snipers is a different issue. So this is what we've done in our mission here, and as academicians, as members of this college, we've actually looked at this and have tried to leverage this in 4 different directions, which I'll briefly speak to, each of those missions. We're very fortunate. Our portfolio through the College of Medicine and under the direction of Dr. Alex Lynch, who's here today, now totals about $24 million over about a 5-year period. And I'll show you how we're trying to leverage that to the advantage of not only our trauma patient population here in Cincinnati, but for our soldiers. So we do lots of clinical research. Here's one of our first projects. Here we are sitting in a bus on an airfield in Iraq with 2 patients who are being taken care of on ventilators. If I have them on that bus too long and I exhaust my oxygen supply, which is a little tank right there, then I'm in trouble. So we came back to Cincinnati, and working with the university and through our academic mission, we actually took the military ventilator we used in Iraq and Afghanistan, wrote software on a computer with some of our partners, and had the computer control the ventilator and have the ventilator try to minimize the amount of oxygen. And we actually did this trial here in Cincinnati at University Hospital. We ran 95 civilian trauma patients through this system, and at the end of the day, after about 2 years worth of research, could demonstrate the computer does it better than a doctor and saves about 40% of the oxygen. And we're currently back with the Air Force working right now to field that system overseas. There's a young man who suffered a head injury. One of our research projects right now is to try to understand what happens to the pressure inside the head when that C-17 accelerates at about a G.5 taken off and yanks and banks hard. We actually are doing the same monitoring system over here at University Hospital in the neurosurgery ICU when we transport patients to and from different locations. It's ongoing research, both military and civilian. There's a typical wound in the lower extremity. One of our projects right now is to look at the growth of bacteria at altitude in that's part of our portfolio. We're working with the Cincinnati Fire Department. Why the Cincinnati Fire Department for the military, you say? Well, the Marines want to know, is it necessary to take oxygen all the way out into the Helmand province to take care of their warfighters and an injured Marine who shot out in the Logan province? Do you really need to take oxygen all the way out there? So actually, we're working with the City of Cincinnati Fire Department. Half the patients who are shot and transported by the City of Cincinnati get put on oxygen. The other half don't. And we're recording the results of all those patients and utilizing that at the request of the Navy. The second part of our portfolio is basic science research, and there's Dr. Lynch and his crew. You see right there. One of the most amazing things that's transformational to me is when I trained here in the mid-'80s, I was taught if your patient's bleeding to death, you put a lot of this white fluid called crystalloid into them, and you start to give them some blood. And typically, we'd give them about 4 of those liters of crystalloid to every 2 of those units of cells. Well, one of the things we've learned now is crystalloid's a terrible fluid, and in the military, we don't even use that anymore. And what we do is every time we give a unit of red cells, we try to use it, compare it or combine it with a unit of plasma. Well, we want to know, why does that work? The military made that observation, but working here at the university with Dr. Lynch's lab, we actually designed a basic science protocol utilizing mice to examine why that might be the case. And so we now have a funded scientific research project that is going to span over the next 5 years, looking at the basic science of why this actually works so well, and we're funded by the military to do that. I wish to tell you that we're smarter than any other military surgeons who ever came before us, but I'm here to tell you that we haven't thought of anything new. This book sits on my desk. It's Surgeon to Soldiers. It was written by Edward Churchill, Massachusetts General Hospital, Chief of Surgery, 1941. These are his memoirs from the Second World War. Everything I've scratched my head about is inside this book. And he wrote a book based upon what he had read from Walter Cannon in the First World War. One of the things we do differently is we use whole blood. If you're in my trauma hospital in Cincinnati tonight, I'll use bank blood from the Hawksworth Center, a great source of blood. But when my soldiers are bleeding to death, I get to use young soldiers. They stick out their arm, they give me a unit of blood, and it goes right into them, and it saves their lives. We're educating. We'll show you that C-STARS group here again. We're trying to learn how to maximize the educational process. We get these C-STAR students for 2 weeks, And again, we have to teach them how to work in an environment that's very much different than what they're used to in the ICU. Again, here's that environment, and what I would like you to do, if you'd roll that real quick, this is actually I'll show you the environment of what that simulator looks like.
There is a place in Cincinnati that trains every critical care doctor who works on Americans flown out of Iraq and Afghanistan. 9 News reporter Bryce Onslinger is live at University Hospital with news of a program you probably didn't know was based here. Bryce?
That's right, Carol. All Air Force doctors and critical care staff that work in the air must go through a program called C-STARS, and that happens right here at University Hospital. It's a perfect fit between the Air Force training program and the Tri-State's only Level 1 Trauma Center. Shanna Harper is a critical care nurse from the Tri-State who operates the simulator for the C-STARS training program.
We have some things that we think
I have the ability to blink,
happen,
breathe, vital
but it's all
signs,
based
and they're
on the student
really realistic,
interventions and
especially
what
when you
they
turn the
do
lights down.
when they're
Shanna's our
actually going through
simulator.
the
That's what it
simulation.
actually looks
The
like. We
simulator
fly in the middle of the night in
exercise
that
is the
simulator.
final
We
stage
turn
of
off the
training.
lights.
If there's a mistake to be made, we want it made here in the simulator. We don't want it made on the aircraft.
The 3 is sent in, a doctor, a nurse, and a respiratory therapist.
We're taking a patient that normally would not be moved at all because they would be labeled here in the States too sick to move. And we're taking that patient and we're moving it halfway around the world, literally.
The average medical flight out of Afghanistan lasts 8 hours. 8 hours where the medical staff on board must keep the wounded alive until they can be admitted to a medical hospital in Germany. That's why planning for the mission is as important as executing it.
Because once you go to altitude, 35,000 feet, you can't run to pharmacy, you can't run to the blood bank if you forget your supplies.
The patients are high-tech robots. The scenarios played out in the simulator by the robots are all real events that happen to real men and women injured in combat.
All right, buddy, we're going to have to shock your chest, okay?
Everything the medical staff does is monitored by 6 cameras and multiple microphones. Their work is critiqued after the simulation.
So what really important, I think that's pretty accurate. The one thing you can't portray is inside that room, we put 85 decibels worth of jet engine noise because you can't hear a thing inside those aircraft. So we have to teach our doctors not to rely on their ears, but to rely on other senses. So that's where technology comes in, and one of the things we're also leveraging is our ability for technology. This is actually the equipment suite we currently move our soldiers on. I'll tell you, it's state-of-the-art 1992. We haven't been able to upgrade it for 20 years, partly because of technology, partly because of how the military acquires technology. But right now, we are contracting and we're working on the development of this. And we'll actually probably field this within the next 6 months in conjunction with some military partners, DARPA, and a few civilian partners. That will be our next generation of critical care equipment. And we've just successfully applied for a grant from the United States Air Force. What we've asked them to do is turn the city of Cincinnati into essentially the electronic battlefield that we need to move our soldiers into. And we have to figure out a way to interconnect ourselves. Now, everybody in this room may take a PDA and a telephone and wireless for granted, but understand we can't. If I use my wireless phone or wireless in the back of an aircraft, I can communicate, but I also become a target for a shoulder-fired missile. So we cannot go wireless at all unless we go encrypted with very sophisticated equipment. So we're currently working on a project here in the city of Cincinnati where we're going to use specialized military encrypted radio communication gear to communicate between an ambulance to the hospital to the ICU. As we move, our C-STARS teams actually leave Cincinnati, leave University Hospital, go down to Lunken Airport, and on a Thursday actually fly an Air Force aircraft out of Lunken. So we're going to be able to simulate that entire scenario out of University Hospital, and that's one of the things we'll be doing. So rather than to go any further, I just, again, want to kind of share some of those thoughts. I said war is and war is not. It is still hard for me to separate all those feelings that I have. It's obviously, it is confusion and chaos. That's our usual kind of evening. We always worked at nights between about 11 and 7. This is another night in paradise where we receive about 25 casualties over the next 2 hours. You can't understand war. There's no way you can explain, and we talked about the asymmetry of war. It's hard for us to wrap our mind around an enemy that thinks that a child is perfectly acceptable to target. We cared, 75% of what we did was care for civilians, and of that 75%, half of them were kids. This child was blown up in an intentional attack in a marketplace in retribution by the Taliban for the Pashtun village, having offered refuge to some of our Afghani colleagues. It is triumph of human spirit. This young lady was a project for us as medics for about 6 weeks, and this was her on her last day before we sent her back home. And that's a little necklace made by my secretary back here in Cincinnati, Ohio, and sent it to her, and we still stay in touch. She is over in Afghanistan now. It is brutal, it's inhumane. There's no way to explain what we do over there or the severity of the injuries that I see as a trauma surgeon to a civilian colleague that I work with. But that is what war is. It's the best and worst of all things. This one sits on my desk. This is Rahim Khalef. I took care of Salah, who was the same age as my son when Rahim hijacked a taxi and brought Salah to our front gate. Salah had been cared for in the Iraqi hospital for about 14 days. The Iraqi physicians had told Rahim to take him home, bathe him, and prepare him for death. Rahim didn't accept that, brought Salah to us, and we cared for Salah. Rahim and I slept in our tent for about 3.5 weeks. This is 3:30 in the morning. This is the last time I would see Rahim. We're about to put Rahim, who had never been outside of Iraq, on a C-130, and he was going to take Salah. And about 39 hours later, they were in Oakland, California, where the Oakland Pediatric Hospital took care of Salah. And that was about 6 years ago. Salah is now 6'1", taller than me, and in school in Oakland, going to high school. So that young man is quite a brave hero in my estimation. You never can forget war. These are two young men whose parents I know very well. These are two young men from my own high school here in Cincinnati who gave their lives and gave all for our country. We must not forget that this thing that we enjoy comes with a very definite price. It is a challenge. We must do better for these young men and women who are putting their lives on the line on a daily basis, and I will tell you that that is our commitment at our hospital. If there's a better job than being a physician caring for these people, I don't know what it could be. We are losing our greatest generation as our World War II veterans die, but we are creating a great generation of young men and women who've deployed multiple times, who understand what adversity is, and who will lead us in part because of the Yellow Ribbon Program, which will bring them back to this university, and they will be our next generation of leaders. I'll return you to this, the fog of war. This sits on my desk as well to remind me of the price of war. It's incalculable. It cannot be forgotten. In my estimation, it may be inevitable, but we must not ever forget to strive to do better for these young men and women. And if you would, just hit that. So with that, I'll leave you just kind of with the pictures of my experience of being deployed. I reflect, people often ask me what it's like. I can't tell you. People say, do we belong in Afghanistan? I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that having gone to Iraq 4 times, every day for the last 10 years, my family and I have said the same prayer. Bring our soldiers home soon. Bring an end to the war as soon as possible, dear Lord. Iraq will be home next month. My hospital there is gone. We have small units with our last teams coming home from Iraq. I see now in Afghanistan what I saw in Iraq 4 years ago. I see the Afghani men standing forward. I see the country growing tired of not being able to determine its own destiny and fate. I think Afghanistan will be resolved in the next year or two, but it will not be without more loss of life and without a commitment. If we leave those people too soon, I think we will not do the proper thing for that country or for those young men and women who have paid the ultimate sacrifice. So with that, I will conclude my thoughts, and again, I'd like to thank the committee for the privilege of presenting today. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite all 3 of our presenters up to the stage, and actually, if we could just jump right into Q&A and get conversation going with the audience. We do have a microphone up here, so if you want to make your way up and start a conversation, I'll take the chair prerogative, and so I was struck in thinking about the 3 presentations and the intersection between civilian from Sigrun's notion that in fact the 30 Years' War was probably more devastating to the civilian population than to those that were supposedly under uniform. And to what you're saying, Jay, is that if I heard you correctly, it's 75% of what you're seeing in terms of casualties that you guys are dealing with are actually on the civilian side. So from the 1600s forward, at one level we haven't really sort of solved that problem, it seems, or we haven't gotten to where you started us, Jacob, which was this paradigm of separation between civilian and battle space. So I wonder if you could just reflect on that a little bit, just to get us going in the conversation, and then have the audience sort of join in.
Well, sure. So to clarify, the 75% of what we do, which is either Iraqi or Afghanis, were injuries in large part, but also medical care, because one of the things that makes you understand how extraordinarily privileged we are is when you go to a third world country. I mean, we were the most, inside a tent with an ultrasound machine and some basic antibiotics, we were by far the most sophisticated medical facility within 50 miles, and hospitals and all those. So we would do many things for just medical care that I've never felt more like a general surgeon. I'd operate on kids and women, and so it was pretty amazing, but also enemy prisoners of war. But the toll clearly is in this conflict is desperately hard on the civilian world, and I was listening with great intent about that. Has always been the hardest thing for me when I deploy, is to really understand that asymmetry, because culturally I think it's very hard for Americans to understand. I mean, we think the Geneva Convention, and we think there's such a thing as a fair war. There is no such thing as a fair war.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, even that's certainly the case in the 30 Years' War, where the battles were actually fairly few, and the way battles were fought was mostly, these were very large armies, and in order to save soldiers, this was mostly siege warfare. So there wasn't a lot of interaction going on, except for a handful of major battles. And I mean, even if you think of World War II, if you think of the later stages, the firing of cities like Dresden, like Hamburg, I mean, this is civilian loss. This is, target is civilian. So I was also very much interested in what you had to say about this asymmetrical warfare, but I mean, the example that you gave about bin Laden is one where, nevertheless, in trying to get at the enemy, the motive is still humanitarian concern, right? In order to get at this terrorist.
Right. Well, it's interesting, in light of all the presentations, for me, just thinking again as a lawyer and my conversations with JAG officers, is how seriously they take the rules, the laws of war, despite the asymmetry that I talked about. It's really quite remarkable that despite the fact that the folks that U.S. forces are fighting against don't play by the same rules, professionals in the U.S. Armed Forces still very much take seriously those same rules. And it's quite remarkable that they're willing to do so, and they're eager to do so, despite that asymmetry.
Well, on any given day on our ward, we'd have somewhere between 5 to 10 enemies prisoners of war. They were not segregated. They were on the wards with the Afghanis or the Iraqis, and one of my jobs was that when they were well enough to be repatriated to an incarceration facility, I had to make sure that their medical care, in fact, we had medical units inside Abu Ghraib, medical units inside our prison facilities to make sure that their care was uninterrupted, absolutely. And that's part of the privilege of working with these young men and women that you see. I think most Americans in this room would be quite would be quite proud of that effort. That's a big thing for us.
Yeah.
Can I follow up though? Jacob, this notion though that, because Sigrun, you left us with sort of a notion that law got elevated right at the end of the 30 Years' War. And if we look at it from a linear standpoint, we're still saying that we've got this separation problem. I was taken by your notion that technology, to a certain extent, is the solution rather than a rethink of law in and of itself. I mean, in a sense, I mean, not surprising, a historian kind of gives us a sense that this isn't new. You know, I tend to think about British accounts of American colonialists would have fit your definition of asymmetric warfare, hiding behind rocks, not wearing uniforms. These were not the norms of warfare at that time either. So it seems to me there's a lot of continuity rather than change with what we're facing in the wars of the 21st century. So I don't know if you could just draw out a little bit more about, so the law stays static and the technology makes us sort of fit back within its confines? Is that
No,
the
I don't think
takeaway,
so. It's not. It's certainly not that law stays static. The laws of war, at least in their modern incarnation, are, at least again in their origins, the mid-19th century concept. But you know, from where we're sitting today, that mid-19th century concept is still quite rudimentary, right? So the laws of war are continually developing, taking into account new contexts, not only new contexts in terms of military contexts and armaments and those types of things, but also different ideas about how people should interact with each other, the value of human life, and so on. So it's certainly not that law is static. It's far from it. Simply that I think today the paradigm case, which always had exceptions, right, is a little different from that which the law is based or has been based. And so the question is, how do you deal with that, right? So one way to deal with that is to change the law, and but another possibility is that other things going on at the same time in society, and here I focus on technology, might be able to counteract or to bring, to fill the gap that was created by the change in what I call that paradigm case. It's not always true, but it's possible in this situation that's what's happening.
And isn't the ultimate asymmetry of this actually the use of an airplane with civilians full of gasoline driven into a civilian tower?
Right.
That's the ultimate asymmetry. That's clearly not a normal rule of engagement in warfare, but that was the beginning of that process.
Can I say something? Sorry, I don't think I need a microphone. Thank you very much for your presentations. I'm also a historian, and one of the things that I think is really wonderful about what Sigrun sort of reminds us of is the ordinariness of the kind of trauma and brutality of war at every single level. Because one of the really poignant things about her evidence is the way that it's so physically but also psychologically damning and damaging. So I look at those young men who are my son's age, and it's amazing, and I applaud the way that they're taken care of physically. But then they come home, or they're still there, and they have to deal with tremendous traumas. And I've studied enough of wars in the past to know that the rules of engagement are always changed in midstream. Wars, like revolutions, have energies all their own, right? We can't control this. The United States has certainly broken the Geneva Convention. And as civilians and as ordinary people, even as voters, we don't get to choose always about what we're doing today. So I guess I would just like it if the two gentlemen, you could sort of respond to the ways in which, as tidy as the law wants to be, it's really untidy because war is. And as expert and as, sort of profoundly sensitive as a doctor you are, there's also the wounds that we don't see. And just her evidence, is so poignant to me about looking at that.
So if I might pull on that thread, to be honest with you, the hardest thing sometimes for me is to transition from that environment I shared with you to coming back to Cincinnati.
Exactly.
Because tonight, when I'm on call, there will be 2 gunshot wounds of young men between the ages of 18 and 34 in our city. It's an unfortunate but true statistic that last year there were more young men killed in Cincinnati and Hamilton County than in the entire battlefield of Iraq. And yes, those wounded young men that we see in our military have paid a horrible price and are coming home, but they're coming home to a support network. I will tell you what's really the challenge is to turn that 18-year-old from my hospital loose back into the Cincinnati community, where there is not support, where the law system often fails them. And you know, the violence that we encounter, it is a true statement that it's safer for a young African American to be in the military than in our own over the Rhine. That's where law fails us.
What can you tell us about the magnitude of the interface between the service function that you've elegantly described and the business interface that supports this and that underlies it, the contractors? There must be contractors involved at every step of the way.
Help me understand. So you mean during the deployment process, what is the placement of contractors, or even in this research process we do?
I was thinking more in terms of the supply.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so an enormous amount of the tip over there is probably about 20% soldiers and 80% support people, which is everything from the Afghani truckers who are driving our stuff to contractor people who are serving us in the cafeteria. The biggest difference is now is that the military is a much smaller footprint. When my dad was in Korea, he got served meals by a GI who was working in the mess tent. Today, when I deploy, I get served by a Rude Brown and Kellogg contractor in the cafeteria. It's a huge amount. With respect to our research funding, one of the things that I think is an important thing that I always try to stress, again, I think of this as kind of like the Tang analogy to NASA in the 70s, which is all this research that we're funding, which is, in my estimation, worthy and proximate to bring these kids home, is actually being translated in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'd like to think that we're on the cusp of trauma centers because of what we're doing, but this is all translating into better care. The way we do blood now as civilians is entirely different as a result of that research spent.
This question is from my colleague Zigrun Hauda. Can you give us some idea of what sort of changes there occurred in the law at the end of the Treaty of Westphalia? What sort of things did people believe that the law could address?
It was mostly that it shut down the idea that Europe could be governed by a one hegemon, like, for example, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, or by the King of Spain, or by the King of France, or as one of the things that came up in this whole conflict, the power of Sweden from the north. So that was one thing, that it brought to an end this dream of one united Christendom under one head, under one government. And so what Steiger refers to the summitless pyramid, there is no summit anymore. It's an equilibrium of power. So in a way, it is really the foundation of modern Europe, with this balancing of power as we then have to achieve again in the 19th century and once again in the 20th century. But I mean, these are all efforts at that. And then it also provides laws as to how the various countries in Europe relate to each other. So it's about a European order. And it also provides laws about the situation in the Holy Roman Empire in what today is Germany itself. So what their privileges are over against the emperor. And that also is the end any efforts of the Holy Roman Empire to ever try to force the imperial estates again in Germany. But out of this also come innovations like, these garrisons, like how, the contractors have been mentioned, that contractors have to be much more checked. They cannot go about and basically pocketing all the money, and so the soldiers don't get paid. So all of these kinds of laws that regulate the military are much more become much more sophisticated, or even are created. So I think some of what you are referring to goes back to the brutality and the destructiveness of war. So there is then what you were talking about, a designated area of combat, and who can be who can be a target and who can't be a target, and so on.
We'll take just one last question, and then we'll try to conform to our allotted time here, and certainly invite the audience. There's some snacks in the back, and to engage with our speakers. But we'll finish with one last question.
Thank you for that. A question on behalf of Afghani people, I would like to ask, since 2001, more than 100,000 people died, more than millions are injured. We lost legs, and I met a guy who lost both his eyes, who lost both his legs, who lost both his arms due to a bombing attack. What, in terms of law, what is being done, and currently what is being done to avoid such things? America and NATO went to Afghanistan, but after 10 years, Afghanis are nowhere. They are even bad than what they were in 2001. And for Iraq, I would like to say that the war is being ended. President Obama said that we are coming out on 31st December. But what about those people who lost their lives? I don't know. I don't know the answer yet. So if you'd like to answer that question.
I don't know. Hard to answer the question. The question assumes that there's a legal answer to the problem, and right, there's not always a legal answer to the problem, right? So law is and has a variety of functions, right? So in one sense, it's aspirational. So we try to sort of aspire to a certain type of behavior. And that's not to say, of course, that it's not actually real. So when, referring earlier to JAG officers in combat today and the last 10 years, and they take the rule as it's not aspirational for them, it's quite serious and quite real to them. Law has its limits, right? So its limits not only in terms of its applicability by humans or non-applicability by humans, but also certain problems don't have legal solutions. At least law is not the way, at least in the first instance, things are solved, but politics are the way things are solved, and law comes in to try to solidify the political solution. That's how I think about it. To the extent I can answer that question, that's how I think about it.
Well, I ask you to just join me collectively in thanking our three speakers today. Again, what we envisioned with this was to try to do something a little different, and here to sort of take a cut and have perspective from medicine, from law, and from history in the room together. Again, just to sort of provoke us to think a little differently about big themes. And we are going to re-engage, and hopefully you will re-engage with us in the spring on the thematic of identity. And we will take 6 cuts at that small little thematic. And one of the speakers will be Dr. Gregory Williams from our University College of Law and Arts and Sciences, Political Science. Also holds another role here at the university. So cheese, crackers, and speakers, and thank you again for attending.